Welcome to The World We Got This with Esau Williams.
Hello and welcome. And in this podcast, we'll be talking about DeepSeek. It's a Chinese artificial intelligence startup which made headlines around the world after it topped app download charts and caused US tech stocks to plummet. So, what is it? What is this new app and how does it differ from other providers? How will it impact structures of power in global AI development? Well, to help answer these questions, I'm joined on the podcast by Juan Grigera and Sean Stars. Both are senior lecturers at the Department of International Development here at King's College London. Welcome, gentlemen, to the program.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
And sure. And let's look at the background here. So basically, in January of 2025, DeepSeek released its latest model, DeepSeek R1, which it said rivaled technology developed by ChatGPT maker OpenAI in its capabilities, as well as costing far less to create. Now, its popularity and potential rattled investors around the world, and it wiped billions of dollars off the market value of chip giant NVIDIA, and called into question whether American firms would dominate the booming artificial intelligence market, as many assumed they would. Even President Donald Trump described it as a wake-up call for US companies. So let's start with Juan. So Juan, basically, just give us a sort of an idiotic guide here. What is the new app DeepSeek and why does it matter so much?
Yeah, I think we have to start questioning what's the novelty here. Most of the listeners here will be used to ChatGPT, and essentially DeepSeek is another of these large language models. One that there is like a wide variety of them out in the wild. Many companies trying to do them, and this is one that has been not only because of its use, but because it's able to do most of the things ChatGPT does. The most advanced models of ChatGPT do. So large language models come in very different varieties. And I think the novelty is here, and you said it right, that they could do this at a fraction of a cost. If we come back to nobody was surprised in technological terms. So the technologies they used, I won't get a lot into detail, but one that has been quoted a lot has been called mixture of experts. That's not a technique that DeepSeek developed, but rather it's been around for a while as well. They have done distillation as well, which is using other models to train your new models. They have used quantizing, which is a way of cutting down the memory requirements. And again, all of this has been used before. What's new in a way is that all these combined work well. But the reason I would say there was a shock around this has to do with the political and economic consequences of it more than the technological ones. We can all read the papers. There is a very odd claim that this is open source. I think it's open as in there is some openness. It's more open than the OpenAI models than the GPT models. GPT-2 was the last model that OpenAI released openly, but it's not open as in it's not free as in freedom, I would say. So coming from the free software movement, I know there is a big difference between being able to use some of these models for free and having them open. So we don't know how they were, which data they were trained in, essentially. That's one of the main questions.
If I can just quickly ask then, so does a lot of the nervousness from the United States and investors in NVIDIA, for example, does that lie in the fact that this has been a system that's been developed far cheaper than its previous ChatGPT rival? And what does that then tell us about the development of these systems, these applications? I mean, if they can be done cheaper, why weren't they done so in the first place, for example?
I think you point to the right direction. The question of the cost. Let me say a couple of things on how this is calculated. So one is, of course, you can build cheaper models after you build expensive ones. But I think the main shock, and this has to do with the impact on the stock market, has to do with the fact that this challenges the big tech monopoly on these models. So this shows that you don't need $100 billion to create this model, but you could do this with around $5 million. I mean, there are many discussions on exactly why they calculate they declare this price. Obviously, there is some incentive from the Chinese company in declaring the lowest price they could, as much as there was the opposite incentive in OpenAI in inflating a bit their cost. So once you get into the nitty-gritty of this, OpenAI used to calculate the cost of ownership of the chips, while DeepSeek has gone for calculating the renting them. Costs of electricity in the US and in China are different. Wages are different in the US and in China. And then also, like, they develop models with newer techniques, and all this counts to creating something that's cheaper. But the fact that it's cheaper, that makes it possible for many more companies to enter this market. So the barrier of entry, meaning what's the minimal investment you need to be competitive, has been radically changed, and that definitely shakes the monopoly position that big tech US companies have. I guess also shakes and you mentioned Trump's wake up call quote, shakes the idea of the US hubris around monopolizing AI, and thinking that, they could halt China's development by limiting the export of chips, which I think will come back later again. But also thinking that the US is going to be the sole player in big tech, and these two things combined, I think, are we're actually discussing more than the technicalities.
Sean, let's come to you now. So, what is the impact of all of this on the structures of power in global AI?
Well, I mean, if you look at the latest headlines on how much American AI companies are spending, then absolutely nothing, because they've just announced a couple of days ago that the big five companies, so that's Amazon, Meta, Alphabet, what's the other one? I forget. But they just announced over $300 billion of capital spending. Anthropic, yeah. They just announced over $300 billion of capital investment just this year in 2025, which is a huge increase from last year and the year before. So they seem to be speeding ahead like nothing has happened. I want to emphasize one thing that Juan said, that this seems to be an incremental change. It's not a breakthrough innovation. So they're able to do what ChatGPT can do on far fewer resources, right? So and that means also far fewer chips. So apparently, they only used just over 2,000 NVIDIA chips, whereas Elon Musk's xAI is using over 1 million NVIDIA chips, and so just a completely different scale. So from an investor perspective, that's why I think you saw $600 billion wiped out of NVIDIA's stock market on one Monday, which was the largest in history, because they're spending hundreds of billions and billions of dollars. They're saying that they need millions and millions of chips and giant data centers and everything. And DeepSeek has shown that actually you can use far less resources. But we need to emphasize that what DeepSeek has done is that they're basically, they've cut a few corners. So they're using 8 decimal points instead of 34 decimal points, which is what ChatGPT uses. So they're cutting corners and so on. And so there's the pre-training and the post-training in AI. The pre-training is what involves the huge amounts of data. And of course, ChatGPT itself claims that DeepSeek used ChatGPT's data in that. And in fact, in the early days, 2 weeks ago, this might not be the case anymore, but 2 weeks ago, when you asked DeepSeek, "What are you?" it said, "I am ChatGPT." They probably fixed that by now. From the investor perspective, there's still uncertainty, but from the American firms, they're going full steam ahead on their previous model of just pumping as much money as they can into building out to scale and computing power.
And does what has just happened, this ability by DeepSeek to produce a better AI tool, far cheaper, then supplant America as the leader in AI technology? Does that just prove that the Chinese can do it better?
It proves that they can do very well with limited resources and very strict constraints, because the U.S. has banned the latest 2 generations of NVIDIA chips to China. But the CEO and founder of DeepSeek, Yang Wenfeng, he bought all his NVIDIA chips in 2021. So the U.S. export ban happened in 2022 onwards. So they started in 2022, then they made it stricter and stricter. So Yang basically came in 2021 and I guess saw what was happening. And he claimed 10,000 NVIDIA chips, although, like I said, he only used over 2,000 for DeepSeek. But so it shows that China can adapt and be flexible, but whether they can actually innovate and surpass U.S. tech firms, that's, in my opinion at least, a completely different story. And we actually have a very recent example of this kind of breakthrough, or actually two recent examples. So in 2016, China developed the world's fastest supercomputer. It was the fastest in the world. And that was also seen as a Sputnik moment for the U.S., because, of course, the U.S. has been dominating supercomputers for decades. But what has happened is that Chinese supercomputer is still the fastest in China, but it's now number 13 or 14 in the world. And the fastest supercomputer in the world now is an American one that's over 10 times faster than the Chinese ones. And then another example is Huawei. So they released a smartphone in 2023, which had 7 nanometer semiconductor chips. And the US was trying to prevent 7 nanometer chips to China. But the largest semiconductor firm in China was able to use old lithography machines to do what TSMC could do,
right.
Much cheaper, but also less efficient, though. But so they're able to, do very well with limited resources and constraints. But that is not the same as surpassing.
Good. And Juan Grigera, let me ask you this then. You talked about this briefly earlier on, but touch more on the true innovation. What is the true innovation of DeepSeek? What exactly does it do better than any other?
I guess I think the true innovation is the idea that you can have a very functional LLM. We'd also
help us LLM.
Large language model. And let me say something about the structure of ChatGPT and all these tools we use. You have a large language model which will create text, and there is a middle layer. In ChatGPT, they refer that as instruct GPT, so it's a series of instructions that will then filter the model and give you the output to the user. And this will come relevant later on. So you have the model which people can download. That's a novelty. I mean, there are many models you can download, but this one is very powerful, and it's also a reasoning model which will give you which can develop the answers quite interactively in a way. But like the novelty, I think, is again the question of the breaking the monopoly of the US. I think discussing whether which country will lead is not really something we can do today. I would say in the most immediate result is that I'm sure that NVIDIA is now lobbying for the US restrictions to be lifted, because that causes self-harm to the US model, but also to NVIDIA particularly. Just to add to what John was saying, it's not the only company that was hit. You can look at Microsoft shares as well, declined heavily on Monday. And I think this has a bit to do with the question investors ask about whether by just brutally expanding on more hardware, they're going to be leading the race, and they're going to be guaranteeing the monopoly position. So this is the novelty, I think. You can have a small company that can do this without first investing several billions of dollars.
And I want to know, what precisely was it that spooked the investors?
So there is a timing question as well, which I think was not naive. The model was launched a couple of weeks after Trump became president. Actually, 2 days after the announcement of Stargate, which is what John was referring to, the $500 billion investment in a larger AI infrastructure. So investors were thinking like, maybe this is telling us that there are other ways of developing AI. It could even be done in the US. I think it has, there's a geopolitical question, but there is also more broadly a question of competition. There might be other companies saying we could easily find 5 million and then have our own model to do this or that. And I think that's what meant the great assumption to this day, that in order to have AI, you needed to have a massive infrastructure. It's not over, but it's questioned at least, and that's what definitely halted scared a bit the investors. If you look at also the NVIDIA over 6 months, it still made profit, and stock has not declined. So had a big decline on Monday, but has been growing massively since mid of last year. And as John said, the investments are still planned. And this is quite a structural decision from the US. President Biden, before leaving office, made an executive order authorizing to ignore the environmental agency recommendations about investment in AI infrastructure because of the environmental threat to water and electricity. And the executive order agreed was essentially ignoring the environmental impact of expanding AI infrastructure as if this was the only way forward. And this is, I think, what we have to question now.
And Sean Stars, just give us a bit of a philosophical download here, for lack of a better description. But as far as AI is concerned, what is hype and what is real?
Yeah, it's very difficult to disentangle this. I think so. Certainly, for example, Sam Altman, the CEO and founder of OpenAI, said that we need to spend $7 trillion in AI infrastructure. I think there's a lot of self-interest in those kinds of proclamations. That I think that's the heart of the market route, is that many investors are now assuming that we don't need to spend nearly as much as we did. But again, there's a lot of hype around DeepSeek itself, right? I mean, we still don't know exactly what they did. So they claim to have only spent $5.6 million to train their models, but we now know that doesn't include the computing infrastructure. It doesn't include the salaries. It doesn't include previous training runs. So that's only like one training of the V3, which actually came out in December. The R1 model came out last month. The R1 model trained on the V3, but we don't know previous trainings, and we don't know how much the R1 model costs. So it could actually be a heck of a lot more than 5.6 million. I mean, we don't know. But whether we certainly don't need $7 trillion. And so that's hype. Another thing that's interesting is that it was a generalized stock market route, like $1 trillion in the NASDAQ sector. And a lot of the firms have recovered a little bit. But the firms that haven't recovered in the U.S. are actually utilities sector firms, because these huge investments, like $500 billion for Stargate, $7 trillion for whatever, were based on this model of just a handful, like basically 4 giant companies that would have giant data centers concentrated in certain areas. And so you'd have giant electrical generation. But with DeepSeek being much cheaper now, there's going to be a lot more disbursement of AI capabilities, not just in the US and China, but around the world. I mean, so there'll be hospitals, in Latin America, Africa, Asia, et cetera, that are able to use AI much cheaper now because it's freely available. So this doesn't necessarily detract from the hype around AI in general. That's will change industry, change our daily lives, threaten a lot of jobs, et cetera. So all of that story is still probably true, but on whether it's going to be concentrated within a small handful of U.S. firms, that model seems to be being challenged right now.
All right. Sean Starr, stay with us. Let me just pause the program at this point to remind listeners about what they're listening to.
Está escuchando
Unasikiza kun sauraron. You are listening to The World We Got This podcast.
And welcome back to the podcast. And we're talking about DeepSeek. It's a Chinese artificial intelligence startup that made headlines around the world after it topped up download charts and caused US tech stocks to sink. And with me on the podcast are Juan Grigera, who's a lecturer, senior lecturer, as alongside Sean Stars, who's also a senior lecturer. They're both at the Department for International Development here at King's College London. And Sean, let's come back to you. So you were speaking about some of the implications there of AI on the tech scene, but what of the lessons in terms of competition that could have been learned? I mean, we're also wondering perhaps maybe even about the effectiveness of trade wars, for example.
Yeah, that's a more difficult question. Basically, it's too soon to tell. So DeepSeek trained its models on H800 chips, which are like the third generation of NVIDIA's AI chips. Probably the US is going to restrict those now because those are more available in China. So probably the U.S. will increase its restrictions. And actually, I talked to someone from the Bureau of Industry and Security in the Department of Commerce last year, and she told me that it's not black and white. I mean, it's about slowing down development. We know, she's told me that the U.S. can't stop China's development, full stop immediately, but it's about slowing it down, diverting resources, wasting resources, et cetera, in what could have been by trying to find workarounds and instead of buying the most advanced chips. And so it's unclear right now. I mean, certainly the big Chinese tech firms, Alibaba, Tencent, etc., ByteDance, certainly they have a lot of resources like Silicon Valley. So they will also be taking advantage of DeepSeek's model, and they will also be tinkering with it, of course. But as will Silicon Valley, because it is open source. So it's basically, I think it's much too early to tell right now.
And Juan Grigera, following from that, does this advent of DeepSeek tell us that America's efforts to control tech exports to China, that those efforts have failed?
Yeah, I think I mentioned that shockingly that most probably NVIDIA is now lobbying to lift those restrictions. But definitely trade wars, and I agree with John, these are for the long run. But this battle was won by China, clearly. So we've seen this previously in the US, and particularly around the tech sector, when they tried to impose export restrictions with the aim of limiting their competitors. Used to be, for instance, in the early days of cryptography, there was a very harsh ban on exporting any kind of software product that had cryptography algorithms with it. And at one point, they realized that they were self-harming, and then that meant the competitive status in the global market was harming their companies, that they could not export some of the products. Some of the products also had to be done in different versions, for the US and for the rest of the world, and that was adding overheads. So I think we're in a similar situation. A similar discussion was around GPS. Those who are old enough will remember that GPS used to have noise added to it so that you could not determine the location. This was supposedly a security thing, and only the US military have access to it. And then there was a strong lobbying by many tech companies saying we could sell lots of other products if the GPS network has this noise removed. It was like a cryptography related noise. So I think we might see the same thing with this in this concrete case. It's difficult to tell, but definitely what's undeniable, I would say, is that those bans were not effective, and then they backfired in the sense of showing that you could have innovative solutions. Not groundbreaking innovation, but it's even more telling that given that all these techniques, from quantizing to mixture of experts, were all available, there was no other company that had the true incentive to or restriction to go for an alternative route that didn't depend so much on hardware. I think this is what we're going to see, that the trade war will continue. This is not the end of it, but it was ineffective. So the battle was won in this one.
And Juan, just staying with you for a moment. I'm also quite curious about the sort of broader context of all of this. So take, for example, comparing cryptography bans or the technical implications thereof. What do you think would be the case there?
So in the case of cryptography bans, I think the risk was that if the US didn't lift the restrictions, then the global market would have developed their own cryptography, and then there would be a different path. And I think in many of these technologies, having some sort of monopoly position or being the de facto standard has a market value. So this is what's being challenged by adding restrictions. With chips, it's slightly different. So the comparison it's only valid to a point, but there is still something to be said there about that. I think the other thing we haven't mentioned is the business models. So one of the big questions is like, those only the 300 billion or even the $7 trillion, what's the return on them? So it's not exactly clear. Many of these companies have been operating to a loss, at least on the books. That's the case of OpenAI. So we will know better about it when it eventually goes to an IPO, to an initial public offering. So it goes to the stock market. But definitely that's something to ask as well, whether this challenges the more profound foundations of those valuations and the business models they had in mind on how to make AI profitable, which particularly some of the applications, it seems to be difficult to find ways of profiting from them.
And just briefly, Juan, I'm just curious. So do you think then that stocks, for example, and I'm not asking you to be an investor or a stock market analyst, but just in terms of the hotness of AI stocks, is that now waning with this new DeepSeek being on the horizon as far as investors are concerned? Or is that only just going to take off now?
It's a tough question, and this is being recorded, so you can easily be wrong in a couple of months. But I will say that we saw the impact on the big monopolies and on the infrastructure, and I think that's one lesson. That doesn't mean that that AI is no longer one of the most dynamic markets where to invest. It's definitely very competitive, and even though, as I said, it's not clear, the business model are not clear, everyone seems to have an interest in leading it. So, two different questions. I wouldn't go as far as saying that that we will come again to an AI winter, when no one is interested in investing in it. It's not the end of it. I think there are many reasons why companies and governments will be trying to invest in AI. Now, exactly how those costs and profits are distributed, that's the business model question, and that's a different one.
Excellent. And Sean, many people have been saying that this represents a Sputnik moment, I suppose. Many people, of course, would understand that meant when the Russians put someone in space, it forced the Americans to catch up in the space race and eventually lead it. Do you think this represents a similar moment, that DeepSeek in some way represents a Sputnik moment for the US? And what can America do better now?
I think people thought that in the first week after the huge stock market rout, but I think as more information is coming out, I'm going to go back to what I said earlier, that what DeepSeek has done is more incremental innovation, as opposed to a new breakthrough in how AI models are computed and how they're scaled up, right? So I don't see this as, yes, the Sputnik was a technological breakthrough in the sense that it was the first satellite that humans put out into space, right? And that was a huge wake-up call for the U.S. that the Soviet Union was far more advanced than they thought. And there are some similarities in that the Soviet Union had less computing power as well than the U.S. at the time, and had less access to the advanced technology, especially at that time. Semiconductors were just were just being developed, and the Soviet Union didn't have any. But another parallel could be is that after the Sputnik moment, the U.S. of course spent billions of dollars on its own space program. They centralized spending. They created DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. They created NASA itself, of course, a few years later, to centralize more spending. That's already happening with the 2022 Chips and Science Act, and then on day 2 of Trump's presidency, announcing $500 billion in Stargate and so on. So I would expect that to continue, and I would expect the export controls on China to increase. They would continue to try to tinker to prevent any more NVIDIA chips into China, and maybe even AI personnel. So the U.S. did actually ban U.S. residents, so citizens and green card holders, from working in advanced semiconductor technology in China. They might do something similar for AI, so they might actually ban. Although in the case of DeepSeek, another thing that was interesting about it is that all of its engineers were actually homegrown. They were educated only in China, China's top universities. None of them got their PhDs in the West, which is often the case in Chinese high-tech firms. Yeah, I think from the U.S. perspective, I think we're going to see more of the same. So massive subsidies and increased protectionism.
And also, has this latest episode, these past few days with DeepSeek, also exposed the volatility of blue chip stocks in America, that most of them are overpriced? And I'm also just about old enough to remember the dot-com boom that also burst.
Yeah, that was a much bigger burst in 2000. So the stocks have already recovered somewhat, not completely, but somewhat. And so Nvidia was the worst hit. It lost 600 billion in one day, but it's recovered to where it was in October of last year. And so, that's not the end of the world. And some investors, this is not financial advice, but some investors might say it's now time to buy, right? Because they're underpriced. I think the general AI story is still the same. AI is going to proliferate, and there'll be increased demand for these NVIDIA chips and so on, which is precisely why the big four haven't curtailed their investment at all. They're announcing $300 billion of capital investment this year alone. So they seem to think that it's still full steam ahead.
Mm-hmm. And Juan, if I can ask, what are the lessons that we can learn from what has just happened? There's a lot that was packed into this last week and a half.
Let me think about that one.
It's an exam question.
Yes. Let me put that in DeepSeek. I think we have. You're asking me to summarize a bit the big agreements we have. Yes. Yeah, the big picture. So in the big picture, I think I have to agree with John. AI, despite the questions of how exactly the business models will work for individual companies, is still expanding. There's obviously a very important race, and not just between China and the US, which are obviously the two most important players by far, but it's essentially a similar discussion in the EU. There is a big question around infrastructure and AI and infrastructure, and how data centers will be built and where they will be built. Nobody seems to be caring much about the environmental impact of that, or the energy costs of that. For instance, data centers in the US consume up to 5% of the US electricity grid. And they think that if they expand, they could add up to 15% of it. This is like one of the reports that the US Environmental Agency was handling to Biden. So that's a very important one. I think more broadly in terms of trade wars and monopolies, we have a very old lesson learned again about every time you have a big monopoly, you also have and monopoly rents. You also have a very important incentive to compete with them. And I think this is what DeepSeek has shown quite effectively, that that you could find other ways and you could challenge them. Not the end, as I said, it's a battle, not the end of the war, but still showing that that's possible. The big lessons as well around was how, to which extent AI is going to be weaponized in the geopolitical shifts. I think we're going to see more of that as time goes by, and again, something interesting to learn. And then finally, I think we haven't mentioned that, but in a lot of the reporting around DeepSeek I've seen in media, I've seen the moral panic, which I found quite difficult to follow. Newspapers calling to caution around the privacy of data with DeepSeek and the Chinese company, while you could raise very similar concerns about ideological bias and privacy of data with any of the US models. I mean, they're not definitely not covered by GDPR, and they're definitely, again, they have their own ideological biases, even though they might be less evident to some of us using those. So I think we'll see more of this, but definitely an interesting round of interaction.
And Sean, does it appear to you, as it does to me, that there are just two superpowers in this AI race? I mean, Europe's been left in the dust. It's just America and China.
Yeah, when you look at the data, it's pretty stunning. I mean, there's basically only two players. And even if there is research happening, so for example, DeepMind actually started in Cambridge in the UK. So even when there are startups in other countries, the big players buy it up. And so Google bought DeepMind. So DeepMind is now owned by Alphabet. And because there's only one other non-high-tech company that has a market value of $1 trillion or more, and that's Saudi Aramco. So the Saudi Arabian oil company, and then the rest are basically Silicon Valley. So we're at a point in the market now where it's just extremely difficult for any other countries to break through.
And just before we close, I'll ask each of you the same question because I want your various takes on it. But continuing with you, Sean, are you worried about the future of AI and what it could possibly do? I mean, I remember there was a Senate hearing on AI, and I heard some of the AI developers saying for the first time, we are begging for regulation.
Yeah, well, so I'm a lecturer, so I'm worried about its use, its over abuse by students. I mean, basically, we're at a point now where it's very difficult to tell whether a student essay is done by ChatGPT or by the student. I mean, I've been teaching for 10 years now, and I've definitely seen a sudden marked increase in the quality of student essays within like the last 2 or 3 years. Wow. And I don't want to be cynical, but that ChatGPT might have something to do with it. So yeah, I mean, this could upend how we assess students, but also like how we want students to develop their critical thinking skills. Like we want students to research on their own. I mean, of course, use like Google search or whatever, use the internet, but we want students to learn how to research on their own and to think and write critically. But ChatGPT is becoming so normalized that, some of my students are shocked when I say that you shouldn't copy and paste from ChatGPT. Like they think that that's just sort of what you should do. So I'm worried about the decline in critical thinking in society if everyone's just going to use ChatGPT.
And the scary thing is that the anti-plagiarism software, Turnitin, can't pick it up.
Yeah, ChatGPT itself is basically the world's largest plagiarism, example of plagiarism. They're just scraping the entire internet, the whole body of human knowledge. So it's kind of rich that they're accusing DeepSeek of plagiarizing ChatGPT. But Turnitin.com can't pick it up.
Frightening times. And Juan, what do you make of the future of this? Are you a nervous Nelly? Are you frightened? Are you worried?
Alongside other technological transformations, we will see de-skilling happening. And what Sean is talking about, for instance, in the writing of essays, maybe writing essays will not be a skill that will be much valued in the future. And so, we'll have to teach students something else. I think that's not the main problem. But more broadly, the question, there are many questions open. So at least three, I would say. So one is, alongside that process of de-skilling, we're seeing, for instance, in terms of the job market, not technological employment, but definitely the reshift of some jobs and the tasks they do. And de-skilling means that so some of the intermediate level jobs are disappearing. So how are you going to end being a senior developer doing these AI models if you didn't have the chance to work as a junior developer doing stuff that now AI can almost do? Similarly, you could extend the example to any area you wish. The students, our students also, how do you pretend to write an essay that's more elaborate and complex than what ChatGPT gives you if you don't write the ones that are less complex and those in the middle so that you can learn. We had these problems with calculators in math in the past, and I think it's an area that will bring loads of changes, but not we shouldn't be too much worried about that. The second one is the regulators you mentioned, discussing about whether we'll have AGIs or general AI as a general intelligence that will surpass humans. I think we are still far from that. Even when LLM models are very impressive, they're essentially distillations of human labor, and they are getting better, and they will probably be able to combine knowledge in many novel ways. But there are still indirect products of human labor, so I don't see that in the near future. But then the final one, which is not much mentioned in media, and I think it is worrying, is high levels of surveillance. And one very important use of AI is surveillance, and that's not so openly discussed. And I think that's definitely something that might be worrying in terms of broader political changes. I think that accompanied, with high levels of inequality, rising levels of authoritarianism in the world, and the technical capacity to do massive surveillance might be something we should be worrying about. So that's my take on those three ones.
Just very quickly and just very briefly, do you think then that AI is going to actually alter what it means to be human? And I'm thinking just in terms of what social media has done over the last decade, for example. Now you have, take, for example, the field of communications, for example, you have governments and people communicating in a completely different way, which has changed the way we consume news and information, even in academia. And I just wonder to what extent AI is going to become that sea change in human relations.
This is part of the history of humanity in a way that, we have been transformed by technologies all the way through. So yes, it will. It will definitely have an impact. It's already having an impact in, as you say, in the way you communicate, in the way you also adjudicate trust. So 10 years ago, you could trust an image because it was a photograph. Now you should not even trust a video because it could be AI generated, right? Even the production of news on media, you probably don't know whether there was a human behind them or not. It's again about social media. So yes, definitely it will transform the ways we relate to each other. But I think that's something that's been happening with technology all across, and it is not a non-human thing. Actually, it's one of the human activities is doing technology and being impacted by it, and then like, that shaping the next generation. What I think is interesting is that that's not happening in vacuum, but rather humanity is doing that within a capitalist framework. So what we have seen is capitalist technology being used for specific purposes, and technology that serves the purpose of increasing profit being the main driver of technology in the past 200 years. And that's something that we should reflect about. Yeah.
Fantastic. Juan Grigera and Sean Stars, both from the Department of International Development here at King's College London. Thank you very much for your time and for speaking to us on the podcast today. This is Esau Williams, and we'll be back at the same time next time. Goodbye.